Okay, today I want to do a quick-ish, if you will, posting. My dogs run around crazy. Um, on like this deception detection with NLP and a little bit of profiling, but that'll be later. And how can you use it in the real world? Because I had a few people after I posted, we did that call last week, and the people reached out asking, how do you use it in different scenarios? It's good information, but it's like, how do you tell this? And I started thinking where I fell in love with it was during interview processes when I'm being, how to interview, right? Because, when you add the NLP and what we're doing, it can make you a super effective interviewee, right? And I've also done it when I become the interviewer, right? And the power of it, to be honest with you, is it got me hired for several jobs that I was not really qualified for, right? I'll use the example, the prison, when I went to the joint, the prison job I had where I went there, I applied just to be a psychologist, just a, line psychologist, if you will. So I had the interview set up, and I was going in to do the interview, and I hadn't done a lot of clinical work in years, man. Not like, and this is the prison where there's mental health challenges, right? So I brushed up the best I could, but I said, let's use this to my advantage, the NLP, and then even the deception detection, because I also went in, which changed my mindset, and I learned this. Somebody was talking about this when I went through the training, that when let's say you're interviewing for a position or a promotion or this and that, in your mind, you become the buyer, not the seller. Seller is always in the weak link, right? Even though I'm interviewing for the job, it's like, okay, why is there this job? What's going on, right? And so it's a different mindset, which transfers to me, and like Bruce would understand, and anybody's done sales, is it puts you in that confidence mode, right? Where now I'm interviewing you as much as you're interviewing me, things like that. So anyway, so again, let's start with the basic NLP stuff when you're doing an interview process, where you elicit, like let's say like I could do the clinical job thing, it says, conscientious, detail oriented. It's going to list all these things. And some people would assume that's the magic words for the position and the person doing the interview. Au contraire. Au contraire. And again, what does it mean to them? Like conscientious is a nice big word, but maybe they're going to use, loyalty, right? And so you ask, like, what do you look at? Yeah, and I sat down, we started talking at this interview. And, first I leaned in, as we said, because when you're interested in something, you lean in, because I wanted them to lean in, because at first they were laid back, was the regional director and the clinical, whatever she was, of these several systems. And so they're in the power position. So they're leaned back, they're doing this. So as we started talking, first I mirrored and matched them, basic NLP. And then as we started talking, I'd slowly start leaning in, right? And then I was tracking to see if they were leaning in, right? And then I started asking about the job, right? And first of all, I am looking for some deception, right? Because even though it could be a good job, what are the drawbacks here, right? And so when they answer the question, I'm monitoring their blink rate, or they pursing their lips. And the one lady kept biting her lip. When I'd ask a question about, what's the turnover rate of your mental health counselors and psychologists? And she went, well, for the mental health counselors, the very low turnover rate. But as you move up into the psychologist realm, it's a higher turnover rate. And so as she bit her lip, I knew, okay, there's more information there. That's all I'm going for. It's like, doesn't mean she's lying. No, it could be stress, right? She doesn't want to unsell me. And I said, well, and I had to do the hand thing, going back if you watch the other video, like this means you're being more open and forthcoming. And again, she's like this. So I lean over and go, I wonder why that is. And she took a moment. She was leaned back. She leans in and she opens her hands, which lets me know and her blink rate slowed down. She took a deep breath. She went, well, it's probably because if you're a licensed psychologist, you have more options. And to be honest, and she went like this. I still remember that. Her both shoulders went up. And to be honest with you, working in the prison is not for everybody. So it might seem, and then she went and explained it, but I'm like, oh, okay, I kept doing this, right? So I'm monitoring what's going on, right? And then the other lady who was there, I forget her position, but she wasn't making the decision, right? And at this point, I went in with the thought process that I don't care what the ad said or however I got the interview, I want to know what they thought, right? So going to our NLP stuff, as I'm talking, I'm like, well, you interview a lot of people, a lot of excellent, people. But let me ask you a question. How do you know, open-handed, right? How do you know when you found a good candidate? I'm curious. And I leaned in and they leaned in and, it's like, if you understand what we're doing, it's like, wait a minute, right? So this went back and forth, but I'm monitoring. I go, well, what's the biggest drawback? She goes, well, you gotta remember, and they were pretty honest. And the other one kind of says, we usually don't. Well, first of all, people don't ask those kind of questions. And what seemed to happen too is I flipped part of the interview. Instead of them like screening me out, I'm like, oh, and the one lady went, wow, we usually don't talk about this stuff. And I'm like, well, what's the drawback? And the one leaned in and goes, honestly, it's the fact every day you go to work, you're going to prison. You go through like 3 levels of security. They check your lunch, but you had to take your lunch in, right? And so you had to, open your lunch bag. Sometimes they would open the sandwiches and look at, it was sanitary, but you're like, really? It's like, it's a prison, right? And then they started sharing, and I'm like, oh, this is. She goes, yeah, because they just caught a guard sneaking in like 100 Oxycontins in his sandwich, right? And she goes, well, he'll be in the prison system for a lot longer now, right? But or they're checking things like that. And she goes, and honestly, I still remember. She goes, in a couple times, we've had people forget that like their cell phone's in their bag when they're going through security. No big, and the other one, yeah, you think no, and she did this, no harm, no foul. Au contraire, in the prison system, they could charge you at that point with a felony, right? And I'm like, oh, that's something to bear in mind, So we go back and forth. This interview goes on, but each time I'd say, so especially about when you found the right choice, and then we were going back and forth. And like I said, my clinical career wasn't enough to do what they ended up doing. But I said, well, one last question. Eyes open. Have you ever hired someone that like may not seem to be the best choice, but turned out to be perfect? And they both went, oh yeah, there was, because the one lady also hired nurses and medical doctors. She goes, oh yeah, there was one. It's like, guy been in the system now 5 years, loved it. I'm like, oh, okay, so you'll know. And then I left, right? But the interview was over. And I was tracking the time. It was supposed to be like a 15-minute interview. It went about 25 minutes, right? And so the interview process, right? And so as I was driving home, before I got home, phone rang. It says, Dr. Horton, yes. Well, we just talked to you. I said, yeah. And and I still remember this because I find it amusing. Well, good news and bad news. I said, well, what's the bad news? We're not going to hire you for the psychologist position. I said, well, then, first time they met the real me, then what the fuck is the good news? And she goes, we'd like to offer you the clinical director spot. right? Which was like 20 grand increase in pay, you know, your own office, all this. I'm like, okay, right? And so that's like how you could use it in that situation, right? And here's an interviewing technique a lot of people don't know. Back when I first learned this, I had to go to, and I've had to be on a couple of these, where you go in if you ever had an interview where there's a panel, there's several people there. You see it a lot in education and health, you see it everywhere, right? So there's several people, right? And so I made the cut to at least go into the room, and it was for the director for the Governor's Commission for a Drug-Free Indiana or something like that, right? And so I walked in and, you know, sat down in my little chair like this, right? I don't need these on, right? Sat down in my little chair like this, you know, briefcase there and sitting there. Now, a lot of people would say, if you're going to do this, right? As the people are asking the question, you know, make eye contact. If it's like Bruce over here, you're making eye contact. And then make sure you look at everyone else in the room, right? To get that thing. And I'm like, okay. So I was, and then a friend of mine from my NLP training called him up. You know, he's a psychologist. I said, what do you think? He goes, well, to tell you the truth, he goes, I used to think that way too, till he took a job as the director of a psych program at a college. He goes, I'm doing those interviews all the time. I said, yeah. And he goes, the opposite. What they're telling you sounds good. It's one of those, in theory, it should work, but in reality, it doesn't work. And he goes, when you're on those boards, you know, if you're asking the question, you're listening for the answer, right? And he goes, and you'll see that when people kind of go back to the deception thing, where people lean in when they're interested. He goes, you'll lean in, you'll ask the question, and you'll listen for the answer. He goes, you'll notice the rest of the people are leaning back, and they kind of look like they're listening, but they're not listening. They're thinking about what's for lunch, what do I got to do this afternoon, why do I have to do these stupid meetings, you know, and they're doodling, things like that. They're making eye contact. He goes, so he coached a guy to go through this, and he said, this is what I would tell you to do, is as the person asks the question, you lock in on them. You disregard the rest of the panel. They don't exist at that moment. And you do everything we just said for the other interview, like, you know, well, that's a good point. You always say, like, you're the expert. You're the expert. You know when you found the perfect person, everything we just said. And then as soon as that question was, oh, thank you, Dr. Horton, and you lean back a little bit, and then the next person asks, you know, if it's Michelle over here, you do the same thing. You blow off the rest of the panel, right? And again, it goes against what some people, and I teach this, people go, no, that's not true. And I go, wait a second. I got the position. After they offered it to two people, as the one guy said that we knew wouldn't take the job because it was a pay cut, right? And I'm like, oh, okay. And I go, but I did ask. I said, well, just out of curiosity, what was the general consensus? Why did you decide to hire me for this position, right? And he leaned in, he goes, you made more of us feel comfortable than anyone else, right? And I'm like, oh. And then so I called Michael, and that was the guy's name. I said, hey, thanks for that the interview information. And then I got that position. And one of my jobs was I was on these panels all the time interviewing people for different things, right? And I'm like, he was telling the truth. I'd be sitting there if Michelle's interviewing, you know, if I didn't ask the question, doesn't concern me, you know, it's not clinical, it's not the side I take care of, you know, I'm not in the room. Mentally, I'm probably at the dojo, or didn't have horses then, but it's like now it'd be like, okay, I might, but I'm not there. But when it was my turn to ask, you know, so if it's a group interview, and I taught this to someone in the dating realm, how to use deception detection and NLP in the dating realm, because again, you know, sorry about the dog. But the person was saying, you know, because you want to make sure, like when you're asking a person you might date, if you will, you know, are they being forthcoming? Are they being truthful? Right? And I coached him through this, and he would start asking, like, in a first date scenario. I've been married forever, so I wouldn't. I said, I'm only teaching what other people have said, but not what the typical NLP seduction bullshit would say, or this or that. You're still doing the marrying and matching when you sit down to meet somebody, right? But if you elicit the correct information, right, and you're asking the questions, you're looking for, are they being forthcoming, right? And the one thing he said that I taught him, and he goes, when I watched those interview things from how you were teaching deception, what I started using was they do a thing where, the interviewer, especially for criminal investigation, will minimize the crime to make it seem like it's not that important, right? And also maybe self-reflect, like, yeah, I got a ticket the other day, so it like loosens them up, right? And so he'd say, like, when he'd be doing like, he did a lot of speed dating. So they're sitting there trying, he goes, let me ask a quick question. And he would mirror match. He goes, there's a lot of attractive people here, and maybe you like a certain type of person. What type of person do you find attractive? And again, those of us that trained in this know that it doesn't matter. There goes my dog. It doesn't matter, if, like Michelle said, tall, dark, and handsome, right? All that means is that part of her brain's running. And if you're in front doing this, it'll transpose on it. And let's say the person did say not quite what you are. Well, I can understand that. But have you ever been attracted to someone that was different than what you expect? Right? Most of us can relate to that. So he was doing that. But then he learned this. He goes, but I have to fess up, the self-disclosure. I'm here because I had a relationship I really liked and I screwed it up. And I forget what he would say. He wouldn't say like infidelity, but he'd say, it's like whatever it was. But he would say, something that it was basically his fault. And then he would ask them, well, has that ever happened to you? And he was looking for, the lip biting, lip pursing, making a fist, right? Because he goes, I wanted to screen out the crazy ones, right? Not to sound sexist, but there's that, the crazier they are, usually the hotter they are. And I've heard women say the same thing, they look like Brad Pitt, what's under the surface. And so, he's looking for, like, well, it's never my fault. And again, and this guy was in his 30s. And so if you're in the dating pool in your 30s, there's a reason. And again, it's an interview process. So he's looking for basic deception, and so that's in the interview process. Now in the sales process, I'll give these three, right? Interviewing, the dating, and even in the sales process. What's kind of interesting is when you go to ask questions, right? Again, use all the NLP, mirror match, do everything we say, look for the magic words, do this. But look for the markers when you're asking, like, Bruce, here's the program. You can get the basic master trainer NLP. It's usually like whatever it is, $29.95, blah, 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 $14.95. How's that price to you? And you're just waiting to see, do they go, okay, that's good. Well, let you know that, like, there's some hesitancy. Again, you're not really seeing if they're lying, you're seeing, is there some stress level? Maybe they can't afford it. Or the flip side would be, it doesn't seem like it's a realistic price. Right? So, but you get that info, right? Or, the product that, you point out all the things and go, do these fit your needs? Do these fit all of your needs, Miss Hoffer? Pretty much. Well, you need to know, how, does that make sense, right? So you're kind of tracking just the stress level, And the one guy that took this and ran with it, said the biggest thing he found was asking, and again, he would self-disclose. He goes, I'm a salesperson. This is what I do. And the only thing that frustrates me is when someone says they're going to make a decision quickly and then they don't. So what's your time frame for making this decision? I mean, is it within a week or two, or what are you looking at? Right. And so then he could narrow down when to do the follow-up call, when to do the things that were the typical sales things that you would do. Right. And also, he would flip in the idea of, like, many times people say that they're going to, in this sales process, they're going to, and a car salesman taught me this one, you're going to go home and, like, talk it over with the wife, if it's a guy. And he'd do it to women, and women go, I'm going to go home, talk it over with my husband. Oh, you can't make the decision? Either, and he goes, that works for men or women. It's like, basically he'd say, I ran your credit. You could buy the car with just on you. Who's going to be driving a car? Michelle, are you going to drive it, or is Bruce going to drive it? And it would be that, and he would hold his hands out. He goes, because he may have a different criteria. Or she may have she wants a minivan, he wants a vet, 2 different cars, right? They're both transportation. So again, when you're going to use this kind of how to use deception detection for, like things like interviewing, dating, sales process, right? And then just to generalize it, anytime you're having an interaction and you're trying to get some information, look for how forthcoming they are. I was buying a set of tires, and the person went like, and we needed tires. So, they have you a little bit on the thing on my wife's truck, right? And he's like, well, this is the best I can do. But the way he did it, he goes, because you always say, is this the best price? Yeah, this is the best I can do. And so I said, there's nothing else you can do. Can't you look at, I forget what I did after that, but I knew that there was probably a little bit better deal, right? I don't know. Sometimes in some of these situations, there may not be a great deal, but maybe you can get a little sweetener, so he didn't charge me for disposing the other tires and doing the balance and all that kind of stuff. So it probably saved me, $30 a tire. And so, so there's just some ways that you could do it. So if you have questions, make sure you sign up for the deception detection course, which is March 26th at 12 noon. We'll be going into detail for how you mark deception and then places to use it and how to use it, right? Which will then later on transfer to the next course, which will be how to use the profiling. And then you put together the whole program where it's deception, profiling, whether it's for whatever you're doing. So if you have any questions, just reach out.